Hi, I am Jennifer Taub, and I'm really excited to introduce you to our panelists and this panel. If you can indulge me for a moment, I want to talk a little bit about why it is called innovation and distortion. And part of that well, let me back up for a second. The last panel ended on a non-utopian, on a dystopian note. And so I think it is, my obligation to make you feel like there can be some successes in cracking down on innovative, antisocial innovations where people claim that they should be able to benefit from this sort of positive halo of the associations that are evoked from innovation. We think of innovation, as invention, progress, efficiency, choice. And often new enterprises that want to engage in regulatory arbitrage or ignore the protections that should redound to customers and creators decide that, there are trade-offs and cutting corners is the price they should be able to pay in light of the promised benefits. And of course, we all know that that we're not whining when we object to that because, and we're not standing in the way of progress, because when people say that the benefits are greater than the costs, they are not mentioning that they're getting all the benefits and society is paying all the costs, externalizing, of course. And I think about, in particular, two success stories outside of the financial market context, because maybe banks are different. But let's think about Napster from 1999 and Anthropic's problems today. Some of you may remember Napster was an innovative music file sharing service, peer-to-peer service. And we know now, if anyone listens to music, how important it is to be able to share your Apple or Spotify playlist. But the problem was when Napster launched in 1999, it decided, against advice of legal counsel or without legal counsel, that the copyright laws did not apply to them because they were innovative. What resulted, of course, was immediate lawsuits. And then they shut the business down in 2001 and filed for bankruptcy in 2002. And that's kind of how it's supposed to work. Now, let me shift to Anthropic, which is, you might know, runs some, it's a generative AI model called Claude. And probably I should disclose that given that all of us on this panel are book authors, we probably are class members in the class action lawsuit that is on the verge of settling for $1.5 billion. Now, supposedly, we should all get for each of our books $3,000 at least. I'm not sure what I'm thinking about the tax consequence of that. Is that like a tort settlement where I don't have to pay taxes, or is it going to be more? Anyway, I'll worry about that later. But I guess the point I'm making is in other industries, when innovators skirt the law, they do something very different than in the financial sector. In the financial sector, they have enough political power to deregulate and change the laws as they are launching their project or ex post. And before I hand it over to my panel, I'm thinking about pre the global financial crisis, where it turns out every single link in the toxic mortgage supply chain, from the origination of high-risk mortgages all the way from securitization, creating CDOs, naked credit default swaps, as well as high leverage, every single link of that required acts of deregulation, either through statute, through regulator action or inaction. And if you want to read more about that, especially for folks who don't know the details, go to your library and get other people's houses and read chapter 14. Okay. Now, let me introduce you to our amazing panel. We have Hilary Allen, who will be speaking first. She is a law professor at Washington College of Law at American University. And you can see more of her bio online. But what you don't know about her is that there are two words that you cannot say to Hilary without pushing a button. It's a raw nerve. And so I'm going to say those. When you talk about crypto, don't say to Hilary, it's decentralized.
We'll lose it.
Okay, now allow me to introduce you to Anat Admati, who is, of course, a George C. Parker Professor of Finance and Economics, at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. They're both authors of books. You've heard about them. I'm going to skip that right now. But I want to tell you about Anat's new paper, otherwise she'll tell you about it, called Profitable Misconduct, Corporate Governance, and Law Enforcement, which she's a co-author, and you can find the most recent version of that on SSRN. Now, as for Anat, don't ever in her presence say about bank balance sheets that banks hold capital. She'll lose her SHIT. I don't know if I can say that. No, obviously, whatever. We'll talk about that later. And then we have Pat McCoy. Pat McCoy is the inaugural Liberty Mutual Insurance Professor of Law at Boston College of Law. And of course, you can see what she has written. And I want to highlight, though, her book, The Subprime Crisis, which she co-authored with Kathleen Engel. It was published in 2010, and she was really on the front lines of the impact before the financial crisis hit on ordinary people. This goes to, ordinary people in the mortgage crisis. And as for Pat, never in her presence say that the consumer's experiences around losses or exploitation are merely anecdotal. Okay, and with that, I will hand the mic, so to speak, over to Hilary.
Thank you. And it really is such a pleasure to be here in this room with so many people I love and respect. So thank you for the invitation. And I'm actually going to use a question that Mike asked at lunch as my springboard for this. He asked, why are so many Senate Dems voting for crypto? And it's money, for sure. But it's also the narrative, right? Because there's actually reporting from a group chat right before Genius was passed, where a member from a crypto industry executive said, let's be clear, she's talking to Dems, no one's going to primary you over Genius, right? So the narrative matters here. And so that's what I want to talk about today. So the political scientists Jones, Macbeth, and Shanahan have developed a narrative policy framework that helps explain how reformers harness narratives to build support for policy changes. One important takeaway from their work is that the audience will not accept the policy proposals if they don't agree with the setting, the facts on the ground. And one of the facts on the ground that undermines support for so much of what we would have talked about in this room that would be good for America is that financial regulation is a barrier to innovation. That is how it's depicted. Innovation is depicted as universally beneficial force for driving progress and improvement, and we would never want to impede it. So what I'd like to do today is pick apart this particular innovation narrative. And if we've spent any time in airports or in metro stations lately, you cannot escape the big flashy billboard saying innovation. I mean, they just put the word up there, and we're all supposed to say, ooh, anyone who does innovation is good, right? But of course, people in this room remember the synthetic CDO squareds of the mid-2000s, and we know that innovation isn't always good for society at large. In many ways, innovation rhetoric bears a lot of resemblances to discredited theories of trickle-down economics. It's just assumed without evidence that innovation that benefits the innovators will trickle down benefits for the rest of us. In addition, they often misidentify the source of the innovation, and Jen just alluded to this. So much of the innovation coming out of Silicon Valley, so this is where I quibble with you. It's not just the financial industry that does this. Think about Uber, think about AI. Regulatory arbitrage, as we like to call it, is really the fount of a lot of Silicon Valley innovation. Anthropic is doing this settlement on AI, but you know what? Andreessen Horowitz has conceded that if they had to comply with copyright laws, the AI industry would not exist, right, in its current form. And if you've spent any time at all speaking to independent technologists, you know that blockchains, frankly, are a clunky and inferior technology that suck way more than regular databases. I heard 3 people today say, well, the blockchain might have some kind of thing. You're like, nope. Talk to anybody who really understands these things. The only reason that people use them is that their quote unquote decentralization, by which I mean the technological decentralization, is often wrongly understood as something that can decentralize economic control. Widespread misunderstandings about this, however, have often been successfully weaponized to justify special lighter touch regulation for the crypto industry. So an innovation-first narrative depicts regulation as a problem that impedes innovation, but let's not forget why we have regulation in the first place. It was implemented for the purpose of protecting the public from harm. And while it's true that regulation can become outdated or superfluous, the people who are shouting that regulation has become outdated or superfluous are rarely the people who are protected by that regulation. Instead, they're the people who stand to benefit financially by getting rid of that regulation. So I would submit that regulation does not impede innovation. Regulation channels innovation in the public interest. So this is part of the reason why regulatory sandboxes are so problematic. So I have a new law review article coming out about what we've learned about fintech sandboxes over the last decade. We know that they're often expensive for agencies to run. We know that they peel back regulations in order to accommodate the innovators. And empirical research shows that these steps have indeed benefited the innovators. But there is no evidence to substantiate the hype that people in general have benefited from the innovation so accommodated, or that regulators have been able to improve the quality of their regulation from learning about innovations in sandboxes. Indeed, it's sometimes proved impossible to reverse what were originally intended to be temporary legal accommodations, so the deregulation of the sandbox becomes permanent. This is also why I'm so deeply concerned by attempts in the crypto market structure bills and elsewhere to give financial regulatory agencies innovation mandates. There's a superficial irony, of course, in Republicans pushing bills that would make government agencies the arbiters of what is and isn't innovative, given decades-long attempts to depict government bureaucracy as the antithesis of innovation. But if you dig a little deeper, no, I think it's clear that these innovation mandates will be weaponized to undermine agency actions designed to protect the public from harm, just as efficiency mandates have been weaponized in the past. Unfortunately, narratives like the innovation narrative can persist despite their inadequacies and inconsistencies, especially if there's money to be made in perpetuating them. I'm going to highlight for you just two examples of narratives being pushed right now by those vested interests in promoting innovation and disregarding its harms. So you may have heard a lot lately about the abundance agenda, backed primarily by the Silicon Valley elite, but most prominently advertised in Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's book, Abundance. So the abundance agenda has some elements of housing YIMBYism, but has evolved into a much broader pro-innovation and growth agenda focused on eliminating regulations that are seen as impeding innovation and building. Remember, though, that many of those regulations exist to protect the public from harm. I think the perils of dispensing with regulations and following the abundance approach to its logical conclusion are best exemplified by the Saudi Arabian tech futurist city of Neom that they are building right now. Building is forging ahead despite significant concerns that AI data centers will result in regional water scarcity, and despite the fact that more than 21,000 workers have reportedly died so far from construction. If, as many on the left of the political spectrum believe, that regulation has an important role to play in protecting the public, then the abundance agenda is somewhat antithetical to that belief. But the whole point of the abundance narrative seems to be primarily marketed to the left in an attempt to build support on the left for Silicon Valley's desires to build and innovate without regulatory constraints. A narrative shift or push that's more specific to this audience, I think, is the narrative push for unbundled banking. So weirdly, abundance and unbundling sound the same. Their goals are also quite similar. Unbundling in banking, they envisage a future where banking functions are disaggregated and therefore performed outside the perimeter of banking regulation. And the thinking goes that in the absence of regulatory barriers to entry, innovation will be unleashed and better financial services will once again trickle down as a result. However, much as with regulatory sandboxes, this narrative misses the fact that financial regulation plays an important public protective function that unbundling can eliminate. It also misses the fact that economic incentives are likely to encourage unbundled banking activities to rebundle outside the regulatory perimeter. So is it inevitable that these abundance and unbundling narratives will continue to justify subsidies for Silicon Valley to undermine financial regulation and other laws designed to protect the public from harm, given the money behind them, there's a decent chance they will succeed as they invoke the mantle of innovation. But it's not inevitable. The word innovation has not always had positive connotations. Actually, into the 19th century, the word was associated with deviance. And it is possible that the facts on the ground with regard to innovation could shift again. So in my online book, FinTech Dystopia, got to plug it, www.fintechdystopia.com, I talk about some steps that might be taken to nudge the perception of the facts on the ground when it comes to innovation. I stress the need for a big tent of skeptics that include both independent technologists who can point out innovation's technological limitations, and domain experts like the people in this room who can point out how technological innovations are being used, their shortcomings and harms. Skeptics within the media and universities can be extremely influential, but those who benefit from the pro-innovation narrative have also sought to fund and otherwise co-opt those in the media and universities. And so I stress the importance of ridicule by everyday people. Many of the claims by fintech boosters are patently ridiculous, and we should treat them as such by laughing at them. So current events could also bring about a shift in the public perceptions regarding innovation. The financial crisis of 2008 tarnished financial regulation in the minds of many, financial innovation in the minds of many, but not innovation more broadly, which set the scene for the rise of fintech, as Silicon Valley-style innovation was viewed as more virtuous than that coming out of the traditional financial sector. But there's been a techlash brewing since Facebook's Cambridge Analytica scandal broke in 2018. The Silicon Valley elite, particularly Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, and the venture capitalists Andreessen and Horowitz, they are the ones who built the crypto industry, they're increasingly seen to be in alignment with the authoritarian right. And the abundance agenda seems calculated to help mitigate that perception of Silicon Valley somewhat. There's also been increasing consumer dissatisfaction with Silicon Valley's over-engineered and shitified products. And if you are not familiar with that word, Cory Doctorow coined it. He just got longlisted for Financial Times Book of the Year about shitification. I cannot recommend it more highly. So many have argued that this over-engineering and shitification is being driven by Silicon Valley's expectations of exponential growth. Expectations that seem increasingly unsustainable given that the internet and smartphones are now mature technologies. Silicon Valley's biggest success in the past has come from commercializing technologies developed by the government or in universities with government funding. Given the changed funding priorities of the Trump administration, there will be fewer technologies available to commercialize. And if the only publicly funded technologies available for Silicon Valley to commercialize relate to surveillance and weaponry, that could further tarnish the public's perception of innovation. Yep, all right, I'm nearly done. So for now, Silicon Valley's put all its hopes in the AI basket, but there is increasing recognition that the current AI bubble is unsustainable. When it pops, that bubble could look like the dot-com bust, or it could cause a financial crisis. This is my entry for Simon Johnson's poker game. There are several reasons to believe that the bursting AI bubble could precipitate a financial crisis, including that the largest tech companies, all of which have staked their future on AI, make up about 1/3 of the total US stock market right now. That levels of leverage in the financial markets are very high, including hedge funds who are sort of betting on the stock market. And that crypto market prices tend to move in tandem with equities. And so a change in stock market sentiment could well be accompanied by a change in sentiment regarding crypto assets. And because most crypto assets are Ponzi-like with nothing behind them even to cover liquidation costs, a change in sentiment could be disastrous for crypto markets and any financial markets intertwined with them, which could include treasury markets now that Congress has blessed runnable stablecoins that have significant treasury holdings in their reserves. So I've gone a little over time. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. We're going to accumulate questions at the end.
Where is the?
It's up there.
Oh. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for organizing this, everybody. Thank you for all these introductions, and thank you, Hilary, for debunking stuff. Just on what Jennifer started by saying, what gets me upset, hold capital. I also am a little bit irritated when people lump capital and liquidity in one word, which I heard multiple times today, because liquidity is really about assets that are held, but capital is on the other side of the balance sheet. So they're not the same, and I am not a fan of liquidity regulation, but I am a big fan of capital regulation, and I can go into details about that. Anybody who wants can. So we already discussed this, and we actually had the no more bailout claim right here. 2 minutes of applause just about when he said that. The room was ecstatic about no more bailout, period. That was the promise. Just a sec. Where am I? Oh, I can't go back. Okay. I was showing you JP Morgan Chase balance sheet. And this was about accounting. So I'm glad I got to the accounting piece of it, because it's going to play out also in SVB and other things like that. You know, what we know and don't know, you know, there's a lot we don't know. And here we are, bailouts that Dennis mentioned, SVB. This was the weekend, or on Sunday, this was the announcement. It involved the Secretary of Treasury. It involved the FDIC, and it involved the Fed. And it involved claims that everything is just happening with no cost to anybody. Magic. Nobody would lose anything. That was, and the Fed is going to lend, thinking of the treasuries at par. No more bailouts? Yes, bailouts. So the regulatory structure, this panel, I put in a few slides on distortions. Distortions are baked into some of these rules, starting with these risk weights that are very technical, but what they are is you take a balance sheet with millions of assets and you attach a weight to each one of them, sometimes zero. And then they're in the denominator of some ratio, some regulatory ratio. Now, if they get zero risk weight, like AAA security, like Greek government bonds, like all kinds of things, then you don't need to have any equity to back them out. For a while, when the banking regulators didn't like crypto, they put a prohibitive risk weight on it of 1,000 to 250, which is at 8% ratio. It's 100% equity funded, meaning you can absorb the losses. So overall, risk weights, which underpin all risk-based regulation, the holy grail of this thing, is they are complex. They only do credit risk, not interest rate risk, the thing that killed SVB. They don't do tail risk, they don't do correlation, because asset by asset. They are very political. What you favor, you put a low risk weight on. What you disfavor, you put a higher risk weight on. They generally prefer governments and securities over business loans, which usually get a higher risk weight. So they have a bias for exactly what we see the banks doing, and therefore they're used to economize on equity, which is the thing that the banks hate the most. Because if they borrow, they get magnifies their return on equity on the upside, downside is somebody else's problem, etc. Okay? So, and then they're allowing them to use models, all this stuff. So there's baked into this one technical thing is are enormous distortions, where the banks are going to say, when you say, oh, you know, when you want to change something, Basel III Endgame was entirely in the risk weights, entirely. They'll say, oh, I won't make this loan, I won't make that loan. They'll always threaten. Now they're saying, we won't make markets in treasury. And now you got to lower that leverage ratio too. So overall, distortions come baked into the excessive borrowing of the lenders themselves and the bad rules combined. The fact that the rules fail to address that excessive borrowing. So they always say credit and risk would suffer. So this is the equivalent of Hilary's innovation, because credit and risk are such good words. Credit and growth, sorry. We got to have those. Got to have credit, got to have growth. The word credit with a twin, that slightly less positive word. I give you credit. That's like in the end of a movie, you know, I give you credit, it's a positive word. And growth, well, And market liquidity, they say, that's also good. We love liquidity. So a lot of these threats are thrown around every time you're going to do something. And in fact, what's going on is that distortions are baked into the entire situation every day, all the time, not just crisis, every day, all the time. Okay, the banks are not choosing what we need them to choose. They do instead things that we don't necessarily need them to do. Other people can do, hedge funds can do, whatever. So they'll do that. And we have the boom bust crisis bailout cycles all the time. And they are treated in economics like, the earthquake, like the natural disasters. No, all preventable, all, person-made, policy-made. Zombies, I have a lot of slides in which I kind of give you the symptoms of a zombie. Zombie is insolvent, but not necessarily recognized as such, like savings and loan. They report equity, but they don't actually have it. They're zombies, and they make very bad investment decisions. So already when you have heavily distressed, heavily indebted corporations, so important in the market, they will make bad decisions. They have incredible debt overhang that nobody in the economy ever would consider, and no market would ever allow anybody to live like that as a corporation. So extremely sick corporations. And the risk weights and the liquidity will only exacerbate the already existing distortion from the fact that banks are born with a lot of debt and all of that. So effective rules that will push back a lot, and they are absolutely essential. Free markets are not going to do it for you. There are certain addictiveness to debt at these levels. And the only way to push back, which would have been the equivalent of debt covenants for other corporations, are the regulations. Because the depositors don't have collateral, don't have covenants. Who is going to do the work for them as creditors, okay? So the biggest bargain in regulation, and I came to it being a corporate finance professor saying, what the hell is going on in this sector? What are these sick corporations? How are they alive at all? And because they're allowed to, because they get away with it. That's all. That's why. Okay, innovation, here we go. I had this slide from before Hilary told, but which one is it? Innovation, such a positive word, regulatory arbitrage, or profitable misconduct. So I'm going to go there. She mentioned that I'm going to go into my current paper. So this is cartoons. Well, Paul Volcker, innovation. The only good thing is the ATM. He said that right after the financial crisis. I would say, online banking is pretty useful. You can make a deposit without going to the ATM. So, a step for convenience, I would say. But Paul Volcker, the same Paul Volcker, said around the same time to a senator, every time you want to do something, the banks will say credit and growth will suffer. It's all bullshit. This was quoted right after our book came out, and so it wasn't in the 2013 edition of our book. This debate continues, and it is infuriating to spend yet another weekend submitting yet another comment on this topic, as I recently did just a few weeks ago, and recruited a couple of my colleagues, which sometimes I have a few minutes to do, and share it with them. And, back it was, a letter from 20 academics, and the next day there's a letter there's an op-ed from Citigroup, et cetera, et cetera. So I've met the politics everywhere I go. And this is my last op-ed on this subject, nonsense and bad rules persist in banking. So I'm going to focus specifically on JP Morgan Chase, my prime examples, and Deutsche Bank. So I have a German co-author. We kind of compete for going after our biggest and worst banks. So the book came out. So the color scheme is a little different. The last part, undermining democracy and the rule of law, is new. The rest is the same. So you don't have to read from the start. This was a textbook written with blood, sweat, and tears. Some of you were in the room. And now we're saying, oh, you didn't do you didn't find the political will that we wanted you to have. It's still fragile. And now let's look at the role of the central banks. Now, when we took on doing this, we thought we'd have to write about crypto. But that was fall 2022. And for a minute, we thought that crypto was gone. And then came SVB and Credit Suisse. So we focused on those. Bailouts forever, resolutions aren't going to work. The central banks are going to bail everybody out. And they usually have to understand how they work and how they can make any loan, et cetera. These lender of last resort that spills into bailouts. Okay, almost done. So now I get to the misconduct. Okay, this is Eric Holder in the too big to jail testimony where he said, I can't give them high fines because it'd be systemic risk. So, now we can't deter corporate misconduct by fining the corporation, okay? JP Morgan Chase paid $13 billion. We unpack that in the book. Here is their rap sheet from a website that collects things, $40 billion in fine, but they make a ton of money. They enabled Madoff, so all the big names in spectacular, frauds, who enabled them? In this case, at least just financial fraud. And then in 2017, Donald Trump said, Jamie Dimon is going to tell me how Dodd-Frank works. So you see the power. And this is just from a few weeks ago. And so the criminal in the news, again, is Jeffrey Epstein, and huge magazine story in the New York Times that puts into perspective, and we already knew this, that JP Morgan Chase was in the middle of it. So yeah, it paid $290 million to some victims a while back, and another little money in Virgin Islands. Nothing for that bank. Small change for this bank. So that's a paper that we just put out. It was written as a law paper, now it's written as an econ paper with math, some blogs about it, and that's it.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I got people to clap after you spoke.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, Kate, Simon, and especially Dennis for hosting us here today. Today, I'd like to talk about an aspect of the distortion theme of this panel, and specifically my concern that the Dodd-Frank system of financial stability oversight is on life support. So we've been talking about sources of systemic risk. My concern is that our system to try to contain that is basically dead. I'd like to very much thank my co-authors on this topic, Jeremy Kress and Daniel Schwartz. And this presentation comes out of our work together. I think most of you are familiar with our basic financial stability oversight structure in the United States, so I'll make this really quick. That structure has three main components. One is information and monitoring. OFR and FSOC plus the Fed are responsible for gathering data and monitoring the U.S. financial system for systemic risk. The second big activity is activities-based oversight. In Dodd-Frank, Congress gave FSOC the power to push for industry-wide regulations aimed at stemming systemic risk. Here I want to note that Dodd-Frank merely empowered FSOC to make non-binding recommendations to fellow financial regulators to adopt these industry-wide rules. And then the third technique is entity-based regulation. This is oversight of financial firms through regulation, supervision, and enforcement for systemic risk. The mechanics of entity-based oversight depend on whether an entity is a bank or a non-bank. For banks, Dodd-Frank directly empowered the Federal Reserve to oversee them for systemic risk. The Fed uses an asset size cutoff. So there's simply an asset size definition of which banks are systemically important and which ones are not. Similar asset cutoffs are used to determine the intensity of heightened regulations that apply to banking companies that are deemed systemic. It's very different for non-bank financial firms. Dodd-Frank authorizes financial stability oversight for non-bank firms, but under this system, it only identifies one company at a time, not an entire swath of an industry, but just one company at a time. In other words, FSOC has to vote to designate a specific non-bank firm as systemically important, and it can only do so if that firm could pose a threat to the financial stability of the United States. Now, for banks that are systemically important and non-bank SIFIs, they all undergo heightened prudential regulation and oversight by the Federal Reserve. I think many of these in this room would argue that it's not intense enough, but at least that's what the statute says. So how well has this worked? Let me start with information and monitoring. We heard, I thought it was especially interesting, John's comments and Antonio's remarks earlier today, that real problems have emerged with the information and monitoring function. Now, in fairness to OFR and FSOC, they have made important strides in creating consolidating data for effective financial stability oversight, but they have not been sufficiently aggressive. They have not made full use of their powers to subpoena data sets. And they have not insisted to the full degree necessary that other financial regulators share their data sets with OFR and FSOC. We also lack transparency into the extent to which FSOC and OFR evaluate specific companies for SIFI designation. As I'm going to mention in a moment, we have had no non-bank SIFIs since 2018. So we have to suspect that little or no evaluation is going on, and Antonio said as much earlier today. And from that, I can only infer that we are having an even greater buildup of systemic risk than we would have if this monitoring were being conducted. Finally, OFR underwent severe staff cuts during the first Trump administration, and this summer it just dodged more budget cuts in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Fortunately, the Senate parliamentarian threw out proposed language under the budget reconciliation rules to make those cuts, but there will be other attempts to cut back. How about activities-based oversight? Federal financial regulators like to say that this is their preferred tool in the financial stability toolkit. That's just lip service because activities-based rules are almost never used. Once again, I need to stress that FSOC under Dodd-Frank only has the power to recommend activities-based regulation. It cannot require it. So the legislation is weak. This is not a partisan issue. It's baked into a fundamental weakness of Dodd-Frank. The one time the FSOC did manage to push through an activities-based rule was at the SEC for money market mutual funds. Now, getting that through was a highly contentious, long drawn-out process. And since 2013, so 12 years, there have been no more activities-based rules in our system. Add to that, systemic risk in the life insurance sector is a real concern. But Dodd-Frank does not authorize FSOC to even recommend activities-based rules for insurance companies, and the reason is that they're state regulated. FSOC can only recommend them to primary federal financial regulators. Lastly, last week, FSOC took systemic risk from climate change, hence my question earlier, off the table by rescinding the charters of its two committees on climate-related financial risk. So I submit that activities-based regulation, which is supposedly the primary tool in the United States, is a joke. How about, lastly, entity-based oversight? So let me divide this into banking companies, in other words, financial holding companies, and independent non-bank financial firms. For the banking companies, entity-based oversight for banks and for financial holding companies, it is ongoing. But with the change in composition of the Federal Reserve Board and probably a continuing change in composition, of course, we can expect that to weaken. We can already see that in the lost battle over higher capital requirements for mega banks, in the proposal to water down the enhanced supplementary leverage ratio, and the rescission of the 2024 bank merger policy, which Jeremy served in the trenches of fighting valiantly to preserve that. Just for a little taste of the prevailing regulatory environment right now, last week, after the readout from the FSOC meeting, Comptroller Jonathan Gould issued a statement in which he first criticized federal banking regulation for having low risk tolerance. And then he said, and this seems to be a new catchphrase, this low risk tolerance raises the specter of a stagnant and increasingly irrelevant banking system. Now, Treasury Secretary Bessent has also started talking about a stagnant banking system, and this is what they're referring to. So, for the banking companies, it's still limping along. But for the non-bank financial firms, there are no designations. Nobody's designated. Nobody has been designated or had a designation since 2018. The Obama administration had designated 4 companies, but they were all designated by 2018. Since then, there have been no new designations, and that was true on a bipartisan basis, both under President Biden and under President Trump. Designations seemingly have become too hot to touch, and part of this is due to criticism that designation places individual non-bank companies at competitive disadvantage by singling them out for heightened regulation. In addition, the first Trump administration overhauled FSOC standards to make it nearly impossible mathematically to designate non-bank SIFIs. In other words, the new Trump designation standards required a mathematical level of proof that was almost impossible to produce. The Biden administration reversed that, but last week at FSOC, Secretary Bessent announced that FSOC plans to overturn the standards again. And Jeremy and I have been involved in this ping pong game, but this is very, very discouraging. Add to this that the other major tool for regulating non-bank systemic risk, activities-based restrictions, is not being used. So bottom line, as systemic risk guardrails are dismantled, my fear is that we are hurtling towards another large buildup in financial risk that will blow up in a future financial crisis. And so I've lived up to my reputation once again as being a Cassandra. Thank you.
So to vary things a little bit, first I'm going to ask my fellow panelists if they have questions for each other, and maybe we'll get, if you do, one from each of you, and if not, I will open this up to the audience.
Ooh. I'll give one to Pat as a fellow Cassandra. I mean, and really this is a follow-on from the question that we had earlier, but I mean, is the whole FSOC system for monitoring systemic risk irretrievably, like, did it ever have a chance of working, and should we just throw it out, and if we ever get another chance, and put in place a different kind of way of addressing systemic risk?
I would redesign the system, and I have a number of thoughts on this. You do as well. Hilary wrote a great 2015 article on the design of systemic risk oversight under Dodd-Frank and critiqued it. But I certainly do not think that we should give up on the enterprise of financial stability oversight altogether. That cannot be on the table. It is way too important.
Great.
I want to say something about your question, actually. So there've been this talk of, macroprudentials, and there's always these kind of lingo around how we're going to regulate. Now, when we talk about capital regulation or leverage, it's just like on one institution, but as we discuss in the book, it's the interconnectedness and opacity of the system that means that if you make them each more able to absorb losses from all their different interactions with oftentimes with other players in the system, not even with the outside the system, then the system becomes more stable. So you don't always need these fancy buzzwords and these, and then, we heard earlier, Mark Zandi likes stress test. I'm not a huge fan of stress tests because they are, once again, these modeling exercise where you're going to, put some scenario into some black box and out will come some, capital ratios. Like they don't tell you anything, as was already mentioned, nothing. They didn't tell you who will fail in the financial crisis. There are really bad metrics between the risk weights and the accounting numbers and all of that. So I think the issues are sometimes more basic. Do we know the fragility? Can we measure anything till we can do retained earnings, something simple?
Okay, I'm not sure who has the mic, but is anyone here still awake and curious or combative? Great, we have Andy Green.
I'll try to keep this going. Looking back at Dodd-Frank and FSOC, so many of the institutional compromises arose out of agency jurisdictional attachments, put it that way. In particular, SEC saying, Fed, stay out of our lane. Treasury saying, we'll mediate this fight. And, the insurance world saying, leave us alone in the States. And there are pros and cons for all of that. Curious if you can comment a little bit, or any of us can, if you can comment a little bit around what you feel the lessons might be going forward around agency jurisdictions and how we think about where that might evolve, or is it simply a question of leadership? Who the SEC chair is, who the Federal Reserve Vice Chairman for Supervision might be, and how they work together, or the Treasury Secretary or whatnot. Second question, I go back to something Dennis said many, many years ago, which just follow the bonus pool and you'll learn everything about systemic risk. Curious what we know about where the bonus pools are going, and I include Hilary in terms of what we know about the crypto and tech worlds around that, and Jennifer and everyone. What do we know about where the bonus pool risk relationship is?
So I only authorized one question from Andy, but I'll allow it. Can we get our third question? Okay, you need the mic, and then I guess you all decide who's answering what.
So this is to go to.
Would you like to identify yourself? I'm sorry.
Sunil Sharma from George Washington University.
Thank you.
The whole issue of climate was raised. Okay. Now, when you look at all the international committees and so on and so forth working on these so-called novel risks, right? And then they identified so-called novel risks, and then they come up with these precise numbers for creating additional climate buffers and so on and so forth. This goes back to the point that Anat was making about trying to calculate risk weights and additional buffers and so on and so forth. There has to be some need to try and understand what we know and what we can know about these uncertainties that we're faced with, rather than piling technocracy on technocracy. As we've been discussing all day today, it's really not so much about the issues, but the politics of power. Right? The political economy issue is fundamental when we talk about systemic risk, about macroprudential frameworks. Can we preempt risks?
Okay,
it's a totally different.
Yes, thank you. So, which one do you want to tackle there, Hilary?
Could I do short answers to?
Yeah, we only have a little time, so
I'll
short
be
answers
quick.
to everything.
I like simple regulatory responses that are more robust to uncertainty, and they're harder to gain. So with all these new risks coming out in climate, just more equity, more equity. And then with Andy's question,
Unknown unknowns.
Andy's question regards to sort of follow the money. I think something this whole audience is sort of sleeping on, and I would urge you, is to start talking to the tech scholars, because the more that fintech takes over our financial system, the more we have to understand about Silicon Valley's MO, which, as much as you might not like Wall Street, I think it's actually better than Silicon Valley. I mean, in the sense that no, they love crises because they get prolonged low interest rate environments where they make hay, you know, and there's some weird ideological stuff going on there about, you know, democratic collapse might be seen as a good thing. And if you're only focused on our ancestors living in the stars in 2,000 years, you don't care much about financial crises. And that may sound outlandish, but this is all well-documented things that are, you know, widely held beliefs amongst
Yes,
Silicon
like
Valley.
the movie Mountainhead. Just watch that. Okay.
So,
But I mean,
so yes, you've got to watch those incentives as well.
The
Okay.
libertarians around me in Silicon Valley, you know, a book, by the way, on the AI issues, Empire of AI. So that's another recommendation since you were doing that. But yeah, they hate regulation of all sorts. They're going to buy law someplace in some island, but they won't bail out if, you know, SVB won't give them the money for the payroll.
So I'm going to let Art wants to say something, but he's not allowed to. But I'll allow Art, but Pat's going to get the last word. Go ahead, Art.
No, the point about monitoring and lack of information is interesting because I saw a Fed's note.
Oh, sorry. We've got to give you a mic because people at home can't hear you, or the recording can't hear you.
This idea of 1 minute. The idea of lack of information is interesting. I saw
You've
this
got 30 seconds, Art.
Fed's note study said this repo market was now $12 trillion. And nobody had thought in the United States it was over 5 or 6. And the researchers said, well, we looked at the broker-dealer balance sheets. And I thought, because of course they were trying to cover the bilateral repo, not
Right.
just the tri-party repo. And I thought, what the heck is OFR doing? They've been saying they're going to get us repo numbers for years. And $12 trillion begins to be a very systemically important market. So why is OFR not producing these numbers?
And obviously the collateral type matters. Okay, Pat, you can answer whichever questions you want. Close us out.
The one question that I'll answer is the one about turf. I think turf prerogatives of agencies are perennial and they transcend party lines. It's a real problem. My guess is it will take another cataclysmic disaster to get Congress to break away and overcome those pressures. My preference would be to, having a council make these decisions is not working. We need a full-fledged agency with full-fledged agency powers, full staffing. Big question, is it the Fed? We had a very interesting discussion about stripping out supervision and enforcement from the Fed, and that would augur towards having a brand new agency.
Okay, great. Thank you.